Wow. Michael, you make me very proud. Very, very proud of the work that we do. And I'm very proud to be with you this morning. It's an honor, actually, to be with you, especially on an occasion when we celebrate and honor the memory of one of the greatest Americans to have ever lived. I'd like to thank Dr. Hollowell for this invitation and for all who worked with you to make this day possible. Dr. Hollowell, by the way, is also a distinguished Drew alum. So very, very proud. I don't know if Dr. Brandon Cho is here this morning, but I also want to thank Dr. Cho for first broaching this possibility with me. And I should also thank my good friend, colleague, and pastor, the Reverend Janet Broderick, who cleared up for me. I thought I was coming to speak to a small gathering of clergy. And Janet said to me very, very early on, she says, "Oh no, Javier, this is an occasion." She says, "You got to have something to say, and it better be substantive." So I'm sure you will let me know at the end. I wish my task today was as simple as commemorating Dr. King. How inspiring it would be to be able to string together a series of his most notable quotes, their eloquence alone calling us to the better angels of our nature, and the power of his rhetorical flourishes inspiring us out of our seats and onto our feet in jubilation and agreement with his sentiments. How I wish that was my task. Alas, that cannot and will not be what I will attempt to do with the brief time I have been given, generously granted today. I cannot do that because the vision of the world that Dr. King foresaw is far from a reality today. So far, in fact, I would dare say that like no other moment in my lifetime has the promise of freedom and the dream of equality been more at risk than it is right now. Amen. Yale historian Timothy Snyder, in his book Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, argues that we have not yet fully learned the grave lessons of the 20th century, fearing, he argues, that the Holocaust is actually precedent for what may come, rather than being the singularly dastardly event of our past. And he's not alone in warning us in this way. Rather, a growing list of scholars are writing about the fatiguing of the American psyche and the normalization of what we would have previously identified as fascist ideologies and actions. This combination of fatigue and normalcy, some predict, will dull us into missing what may come, which is actually part of an old playbook of totalitarian regimes. In the United States of 2019, I contend, fatiguing and normalization are true threats to our well-being and to our future thriving. Think of how ubiquitous the term compassion fatigue has become, maintaining that the average person is simply overwhelmed, exhausted, and eventually inured to how many challenges we face. We can't help everyone. We can't stop everything, the argument goes. And so we just retreat into our safe personal spaces, numb to the outsized challenges of our day. Someone else will take care of that. Or someone else will challenge that. Or stand up for that. Or speak out against that. But I can't do it all. I have compassion fatigue. I have limits. And self-care is as important as anything else. It is in this space of compassion fatigue that opportunists lurk. For when we're worn down, so are our defenses. our sense of moral outrage, our willingness to risk on behalf of the most vulnerable. And before you know it, a new wall or barrier goes up between us and others, and once it becomes even more vexing to overcome and to tear down. But perhaps even more challenging is the temptation of normalization.
Wow.
That practice used throughout human history to conquer ideological, political, and moral space by transforming what was once intolerable into something tolerable. Now this, of course, can work in several ways. It doesn't take much imagination to see how normalization has worked for good, has worked in positive ways to overcome previous barriers on race, on sexual identity, gender, and national origins. Yet the recent history of modern Europe suggests that this too can work to nefarious ends. And many argue that it's beginning to take place here. The method works like this. Overwhelm the intellectual and political marketplace with ideas that at the time seem outlandish and dangerous, and argue vociferously for them as normal, as having a respectable intellectual or moral legacy. With persistence over time, the public ceases to hear these ideas as outrageous and dangerous, and perhaps they even have some small success. The point, however, is to move the conversation increasingly in the direction of those once reprehensible ideas, so that when they have made their way into the mainstream discourse, negotiation and compromise take place on terms and on conditions that previously could not have been imagined.
That's right.
So today, for example, the compromise isn't about a wall or no wall. Much of the wall has already been built, right? Rather, the negotiation and compromise is on how much more of the wall are we willing to tolerate. This is what happens when the powerful combination of compassion fatigue, perceived personal or community threat, and normalization mix and take root in the collective psyche and in individual hearts. Friends, I fear that as we sleep or allow ourselves to be distracted or to be numbed or overwhelmed by the sheer number of crises and scandals and once unthinkable outrageous scenarios that play out by the minute in our public life, the moral landscape is shifting beneath our feet and we remain willfully unaware. How I would love to be able to look out on this room, at this august gathering of leaders and people committed to the cause of justice and righteousness in our community and in our land, and be able to declare, we're winning the fight. Keep running the race. The goal is in sight if only we stay at it. But the goal is not in sight. And if anything, at times it feels like it's receding.
Yes. Yes.
It's too easy, too simplistic to pin this moral crisis on one person or on one political party. I refuse to do that. It lets too many of us off the hook when we fall into that trap. The moral crisis our nation faces is different than that of Dr. King's, but there are countless similarities, and old ghosts seem to be rearing their ugly heads once again into our shared lives. Dr. King's dream was far from a reality in his lifetime, and although we've made great and promising strides as a nation and as a people on many facets of that dream, many more still remain unfulfilled. It's heartbreaking that today, rather than living in King's dream of a nation, we still live in an America where children are ripped from their mother's arms and caged simply because those mothers are seeking a safer, more promising life. We still live in an America where anti-Semitism is on the rise, and our Jewish sisters, brothers, and siblings around the world have to have that conversation. That conversation. Is it safe for us to stay here, to remain here? Or do we once again need to seek a new and safer place to exist? We still live in an America where our Justice Department tries to roll back key victories of the Civil Rights Movement by limiting access of black citizens and black communities to the ballot box, where 23 states have adopted new and more restrictive voter repression laws in the last decade alone, and which the courts have said targeted African American communities with, quote, surgical precision. We still live in an America where people like me, Latino men, can be labeled rapists and murderers and thieves who are here to steal your jobs, where Latino women can be hired to raise the children of wealthy elite while their own children are taken from them simply for stepping on American soil. We still live in an America where, according to the National Center for Children in Poverty, 41% of children in our country were living in or on the brink of poverty, in the wealthiest nation in the world. We still live in an America where just a few years ago, the promise of LGBTQ equality seemed within reach, but in the blink of an eye, those hard-won protections, won by blood and sweat and tears, seem as fragile now as they did a decade ago. We still live in an America where Islamophobia is on the rise, where being a woman in the workplace is still a hazard, where in the course of our lifetime, the prison population has skyrocketed to the highest rate of incarceration in the world, primarily caging black and brown bodies, which Brian Stevenson, Michelle Alexander, and others have argued is nothing more than a modern, more sophisticated expression of slavery. We still live in an America where schools are among the dangerous places we send our children because we love our guns more than we love them. If you're like me, you can already feel the weight of this brief list, how much more I should and could have added. Or some of you have likely tuned me out because you've heard this all before. Perhaps you're fatigued by focusing on these challenges, for which it seems that solutions are complex and perhaps out of reach. Or perhaps some have made assumptions about my politics, which may not match yours. And so it seems that we are at odds and that we will never find common ground. But I ask you, friends, what then are we to do with our fatigue, with our inability to dialogue across difference, with the normalization of fringe thoughts and methods, with our seemingly opposable truths, and with the overwhelming and insurmountable nature of our local and national challenges? What are we to do with them? Martin Luther King wondered about these very questions while he was sitting in a Birmingham jail. There he wrote a letter to his fellow Christian and Jewish clergymen at the time, who had been encouraging him to slow down the rate of progress, to tone down the rhetoric of freedom. And he couldn't understand the logic of their request. He knew them to be good people, people of faith, of goodwill, who were sympathetic to the cause. But sitting alone in that jail cell for the sake of freedom, he grew increasingly impatient, unable to accept their goodwill and best wishes without any action to support it. This is in part what he said to them. I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in this stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you. I agree with the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action. Lukewarm acceptance, King said, is much more bewildering than outright rejection. Now, he saves the harshest words for the likes of you and me, for people of faith. Listen to just a little more and allow the weight of his words to press down upon us this morning. He says, let me take note of my other major disappointment. I've been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Now, I do wonder today if he were alive today, if he would add the synagogue and the mosque and the temple to his list of moderate religious institutions. But for now, let's just stick to his words. Too many have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise up from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Yes, these are the questions that are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church, but be assured here. Tutoring and after-school programs. I've sat with some of you who are organizing for the sake of justice in Morris County and beyond, and see the signs that I believe would make Dr. King proud. But we all know that the forces of fatigue and normalization will not be easily overcome. It will require resolve, resiliency, commitment, and a willingness to risk. Perhaps status, respectability, financial comfort, the support of congregations even, if the dream is to live in us and among us. Now, in the early days of the civil rights movement, The Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King's closest confidant and collaborator, stood in a Selma pulpit while he knew that the local police were recording his sermon. He told this simple and uproariously hilarious story about a hired hand who decided to call his white boss by his first name, something unheard of in the Jim Crow South. This is how he tells the story. The boss man said, "Now, Charlie, what's wrong with you? Have you lost your mind or something?" And Charlie said, "No, I haven't lost my mind." "Well, I know you've lost your mind, Charlie. You've worked for me for 40 years, and you've been faithful. Let me know if you've been sick so I can take you to the doctor." Abernathy is mimicking the boss's phony and solicitous style of speech. And Charlie says, "No, I'm not sick. I've never felt better. But you know, the Freedom Riders, they done come through town. And they done told us, John," more hilarious laughter from the congregation. "They done told us, John, that I'm just as good as you. I want you to tell Ann," more hilarious laughter from the congregation. "I want you to tell Ann that from now on there's not going to be any Mr. John or Miss Ann. In fact, there's not going to be Miss anything. It's not even going to be Mississippi. From now on, it's just going to be plain old Sippy." Somebody must get the word downtown to Sheriff Clark that Negroes are not afraid of him. He can come out and he can wave his stick all he wants. He can push us and he can shove us, but we're not afraid. We're going to stand our ground, John. And it's that line that I want you to remember today. We're going to stand our ground. We're going to stand our ground for justice in Morris County. We're going to stand our ground for the poor, for the immigrant, for the profiled, for the othered. We're going to stand our ground against fatigue and the normalizing of hate. We're going to stand our ground that religion is and can be and should be the strongest force for good and for love and for dreaming a new world into being rather than a force that separates. We won't cede that ground, and we will use the great traditions and resources of our faiths for the well-being and the thriving of all. We're going to stand our ground. We're going to stand our ground against fear and against the forces that will divide us. So friends, stand your ground. Stand your ground bravely. And when you do, when we do, we shall overcome.
Morristown.